right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Fearcast. This is the podcast dedicated to OCD, anxiety spectrum disorders, and getting your life back. I'm your host, Kevin Foss. I'm a licensed clinician specializing in those things. And thank you all for joining me today for this episode. So, for those of you who are new, this is a podcast where you can send me questions, and it's a question and answer based show. So, send me questions over at fearcastpodcast.com. I will read it, consider it, and likely put it up on a future episode, as most of the episodes have been. Additionally, everybody, you can send me audio questions. So if you record your question, you can record it into your phone, you can record it into your computer, however you need to record your audio, and you can go and email it to me at questions@fearcastpodcast.com. You can also email me like a Google Drive link. So if you take that audio, upload it to a Google Drive, just send me the link and I will be able to download that file, plop it into an episode, and I will get to it and have that up. So I've been getting more and more of those. So thank you all for being brave enough to send those in and attaching your voice to it. The real reason that I do that is just because I find your voice so much more interesting than mine. And I think so many people will be more interested in hearing what you have to say from your voice, not just hearing me read your written questions, though we've been doing that for all this time and it's worked out great. So again, thank you all for sending those in. So this episode is going to be a little bit different. So this episode is going to be talking about trigger warnings. So this is one of those episodes that I record and I'm just going at the very beginning, gosh, I wonder if this is a good idea for me to even do this. But here we are, I'm recording it anyways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what trigger warnings are, tell you a little bit about why I'm doing this episode, and also to introduce my three special guests. So the three special guests that I have for this episode are going to be Kelley Franke, Lauren Rosen, and Nathan Peterson. So I've had Lauren and Kelley on past episodes, and I presented with them at the IOCDF conferences and the national conference and some local conferences as well. I've known them for many years, and you might know them from Instagram. They are very popular over there. I'll include links to their Instagram accounts. But these are two OCD specialists who just they know what they're doing. They are just delightful, wonderful people, and they were gracious enough to be on to talk about their experiences with trigger warnings, what their thoughts are on them, and and offering some advice on how you can best deal with them or deal with the lack of them as things go. A new person to the podcast might not be a new person to you if you're listening to this. The other person I have on is Nathan Peterson. Nathan Peterson is a licensed specialist or a licensed clinician specializing in OCD and anxiety treatment. He can be found at OCDandanxietycounseling.com. Not only does he have a very thriving practice, he also has a very active social media presence advocating for OCD or advocating for OCD treatment. He's an educator in OCD and also has a very popular and very good YouTube channel where he talks about some fundamentals of what OCD and anxiety treatment are. And he was wonderful enough to give us some time to talk about what his thoughts are on trigger warnings and also what folks can do about this. So as I mentioned, sometimes I just do some episodes and wonder, is this going to be a really good idea or is this going to be a terrible, terrible idea? And sometimes I just don't know. And but I thought, why not talk about this at some point? Because trigger warnings, for those of you who are new to them, or let's be honest, if you've been on the internet or been in existence for any amount of time, you're familiar with trigger warnings. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of them, talk a little bit about the research behind them, and then tell you a little bit about my feelings behind them or of them or towards them as well. I feel a little sheepish even starting this episode because I feel like I want to offer a trigger warning to people as I progress into this episode. However, I also realize that is, as you will soon hear, slightly hypocritical and perhaps a little silly for me to do that. But it's one of those episodes where I, as a therapist, and I just as a person, sometimes worry that this will be controversial, or it will be upsetting, or it will be bothersome. But as I will get into, we will talk about what that is all about. So the inspiration for this episode really came from, a bunch of episodes ago. I had offered, or I had done a podcast on some content, and I got an email from a listener, and thank you so much for sending this in, that they thought that I should have tagged a trigger warning onto that episode, just to let somebody know who might be listening that, I'm going to be talking about some content that might be upsetting, might be bothersome to some people, and that the people who might be activated or triggered by that information may want to know in advance what they're getting into before they find themselves in the middle of something that may be becoming triggering or bothersome or distressing to them. So it got me thinking about, this is an episode, or this is a podcast about OCD. This is a mental health related informational podcast. And do I really need to be putting on a trigger warning for something? Knowing that, y'all listening to this, you know that we talk about some very awkward, very uncomfortable, very sometimes taboo subjects, right? Do we need to be expecting, do we need to be anticipating that we should be getting trigger warnings? So I wanted to kind of delve into that, and that's why I have some guests on to reach out to them to ask them what their opinions are on this. And again, we'll get to those interviews here in a bit, but why don't we just get into a little bit of this? So for those of you who may not know, trigger warnings are it's a notice that some content may be distressing. Now these were originally way back in the day, in the early 2000s. They were added by some blog writers at the very beginning of their articles to talk about and warn readers that potentially there's going to be some information in here that might be activating to someone. And this was really to anticipate somebody's potential PTSD, a trauma history, to help them anticipate, prepare for, or potentially avoid information that may re-trigger the experience of trauma. So they started out as a very innocent sort of way to let people know, or give them the option to either proceed and maybe get triggered, but also to potentially not read it and avoid some unwanted feelings. Now, these trigger warnings as an idea started to gain some traction and have started to become part of the academic circles, or the academic scene, where in a lot of colleges, professors would talk about or give a trigger warning for content that may be coming up either in the class or maybe imminent in the lecture or in the readings that may make people feel uncomfortable. And the purpose of them the purpose of them ultimately is to acknowledge the potential pain that someone may have, and to validate their humanity in that situation that may cause them some significant pain. So at its core, they can be very heartfelt. They can be very thoughtful for someone. They've obviously, if you have been paying attention at all, they have become very politicized as well. People have a lot of problems in saying, well, we're caring after snowflakes who can't take care of themselves, or we can't whitewash everything to make everything be just happy and clean and without problem. That people need to toughen up is some of the criticism that people have been getting. And to a certain degree, I also understand that perspective. So they've done some research into this, and the research is actually kind of interesting, at least I found. So at least in a summary or the conclusions of it, one study found that trigger warnings actually didn't significantly reduce the subjective experience of anxiety, therefore was not effective in the long run compared to actual therapy. So specifically for people who are experiencing trauma, having a trigger warning in this study didn't find that it reduced anxiety that much when compared to someone actually going through therapy to deal with that trauma. That was more effective. Now, in other cases or in other studies, they found that trigger warnings actually increased the amount of anxiety and anxious response from people. So when they said, hey, everybody, there's going to be a trigger warning for X type of content, that actually increased someone's subjective experience of anxiety and distress in anticipation for what they may encounter, not even having encountered it. So, other research found that trigger warnings can prolong the suffering for those who are diagnosed with PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. So, someone who's had a trauma, and they find, and they are kind of identifying with this. So in other words, that the diagnosis of PTSD and that trauma has become a central component to their identity. This person found, or this study found, that folks who are kind of making their diagnosis more of who they are rather than something that they are experiencing or something that they are suffering with. For this person, trigger warnings prolonged it, kind of made it a bigger deal than it should have been. I will also say this. Despite the fears that trigger warnings would lead to just this massive avoidance, these studies ultimately found that they didn't actually lead to mass avoidance of materials. So while they didn't lead to mass avoidance of the materials, they ultimately found that trigger warnings, and this is kind of study after study, found they didn't really work in really reducing someone's anxiety. It just kind of didn't really do a whole lot. One person actually recommended, or one study I read, or one paper I read rather, talked about how some people have recommended, instead of using the word trigger and warning, so trigger warning, for this, they should be using something called a content note. The idea that the word or the phrase trigger warning can be activating and insinuate that people ought to be afraid. So they should be nervous following this information or in anticipation of this information. In other words, saying that this information is threatening and dangerous. But however, the critics of this, of saying instead of trigger warning, they should say content note, is that they essentially said people aren't stupid. People know what a trigger warning is, and they're going to hear content note, and they're going to know content note is code for trigger warnings. So that's one of the suggestions that people have made to try to get around this term. So if research is showing that trigger warnings ultimately aren't really helpful in helping someone to deal with trauma or anxiety or distress in someone's life, I guess the other question is, well, are they harming anybody? So as I previously mentioned, while the initial criticism of them is that they would lead to just massive avoidance, and we all know what anxiety or how anxiety responds to avoidance, right? It ultimately doesn't help. While that was an initial fear, again, these studies didn't find that people were avoiding things. So if research is showing that trigger warnings ultimately aren't very helpful, one may ask, well, are they harmful? Are they not helpful for what their intended purpose is? So as I previously mentioned, while some of the initial criticism was that people may just massively avoid the information or click out of or not engage with whatever content it is, people found that actually wasn't really happening. But what it ultimately doesn't allow people to do is to be able to have flexibility with information they're hearing and to be able to tolerate information that just comes. Additionally, if people are using trigger warnings or expecting trigger warnings as a way of effectively dealing with and managing their anxieties, as their triggers, I'm going to say that word so many times today, triggers and just the stuff that bothers them, rather than engaging with treatment, then they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot. They're kind of saying, I need to make sure that anything that bothers me is, in a sense, avoided or named or cited so that I can kind of move around it, so that I know that I can have the right response to it. It kind of sends this message that the world around us is constantly dangerous. The world around us needs to be carefully anticipated, that there are tigers around every single corner, and that these are things that I just can't deal with, that I'm unable to manage it. Now, I'll get into some of the ways that people can start to manage this, but the reality is that even if we get a content warning or a content note or a trigger warning, whatever it may be, it's going to ultimately be impossible to anticipate all content that could activate somebody's or even your own trauma, anxiety, or pain. So I want to give you an example. So let's say, if we're talking about having a car accident on the way to go see the LA Dodgers, right? To see them play. Well, I could provide a trigger warning about potentially graphic information about the accident, right? Or just kind of simply about car accidents can be triggering to people. Now, that might help people in some instances, but ultimately that's not going to help someone whose abuse history was perpetrated by a father who loved the Dodgers, or someone who gets panic attacks or panic symptoms when they start thinking about large crowds. So while the trigger warning may be about a content A, I can't anticipate as a educator, as a therapist, writer or blogger or podcaster, that subject B is not the problem here, or that quote the problem. So even if someone who then is kind of hoping or expecting that they're going to hear trigger warnings about stuff so that they can manage their own expectations, or that they can make that decision on their own whether or not they should engage with it or avoid it, they can't even predict that trigger is going to ultimately be helpful for them in whatever trauma constellations that they have in their life. So then what is it that any one of us can do about these trigger warnings? Well, as we know, avoiding them only gives temporary relief. But so we need to find out a plan on how we can deal with just situations as they arise, situations that may cause us nervousness or distress. We need to have a plan. So a couple things that we can do about it. So number one, for you out there, know what your triggers are as best you possibly can. Consider and acknowledge just what triggers you, what makes you feel uncomfortable, what brings on that distress, and begin working really hard to start facing those issues through therapy as best you can, as best as your means are available. So, similar to that, then engage with therapy. Now, again, there are going to be a lot of different ways that you can do this. There's going to be a lot of free resources out there if you don't have access to treatment. But there's going to be information out there through books or blogs or podcasts or a number of different ways online. There are libraries that have really fantastic books on how to deal with trauma or distress or anxiety or phobias. But to engage with it, and that might be, again, through exposures, trauma treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness and acceptance, meditation, medication. All of these things are ways to help deal with your trauma and anxiety. Next is you should develop a really good set of coping skills. And that can be through breathing exercises, diffusion through ACT, attention training, just general self-care, exercise, and even therapeutic relationships with a therapist or friends. So having a couple of things that you know that you can do. So when you get triggered, not if, but when you hear information that's anxiety provoking, ultimately I'm saying, how is it that you're going to deal with that anxiety? How are you going to ride that wave of anxiety? We all need to have those special tools and tricks. Now, I will say avoidance is one of them. It's one of them. It's not the number one, but it's one of them. So when stressful things happen, or if we know we're just kind of raw about a certain subject, of course we need to talk about it. We need to deal with it. We need to find a way to get square with it with ourselves. But other ways that we can deal with our anxiety, you know what? As I previously mentioned, doing breathing exercises, taking a break, chatting with people, expressing yourself, practicing distancing yourself from that content, not engaging with this rumination. Another thing that can be helpful is to practice non-engagement responses to triggers. And I might have talked about these on a previous episode, but non-engagement responses are things that we can say that acknowledge the distress, the pain, the urges that we have, but without actually then getting into an argument with them or against them or about them. So, for example, we might say like, hearing that makes me feel so frustrated. Hearing that makes me want to leave the room. I'd say, gosh, if that were to happen to me, or if that were to happen to me again, that would be awful and terrible. Now, some of these things can be helpful, but ultimately in that statement, it acknowledges our experience, it acknowledges the feelings that we're having, but it also doesn't say that I need to do anything about it further, other than be in the moment, other than to be here. And then in that we are riding out that anxiety, that momentary sense of distress that will always pass. But to say that we are without skill, or that we are without any tools to be able to manage it, and to say that we then need to have a warning about it is kind of shooting ourselves in the foot and selling ourselves short. To the point about non-engagement responses, I'll say, while I said stay and face them, I'll say unless your trauma therapist or other healthcare provider suggests or tells you otherwise. So all of this should be taken into account with what your clinician, what your therapist is telling you and advising you to do. Lastly, we should all be practicing flexibility and personal accountability. Now, this is part of one of those things that is just feels unpopular to even say. And it's not blaming the victim, but it's to say that we all need to be able to take responsibility for ourselves and our reactions in a sometimes unpredictable and triggering world. We need to know that some things are going to be upsetting and annoying and frustrating, but we also need to own that ourselves and figure out ways that we can best deal with it without the expectation that other people are going to do that for us, that other people are going to manage it for us. We are the responsible parties for ourselves. And it's frustrating, though. It is frustrating. I remember years ago when I was going through some health issues, some very personal, very sensitive health issues that were incredibly upsetting to me. They were incredibly overwhelming, and it was one of the hardest times of my life. For whatever stinking reason, that subject was everywhere. It was on every show we watched. This is an exaggeration. It was on many shows that we watched. It was on many movies that we watched. It was in popular culture. People were talking about this thing. And it felt like we just couldn't escape it. My wife and I, we just couldn't escape it. It was so bothersome. Now, again, while I say it was everywhere, it was probably, in retrospect, it was probably only a few places, but gosh, when we're dealing with something intense, we feel like it's everywhere. And I fell into the trap myself as I'm talking to you all, that though we felt like it was everywhere, it was probably just a few places. But I'll tell you, it was incredibly bothersome. But I also found a way to stick to it, stick through it. What I did was, you know what, I was able to say, gosh, this is really bothersome, or, oh, it's this again. And I tried to be humorous about it, like, do my eye roll approach, right? Ugh, this crap again. Or, oh, of course they're going over this. Or, of course this is in this show again, right? That it's everywhere. And it kind of became a joke. This is the thing that they're talking about everywhere. Of course they are. Eye roll. Right? Now, it's been some years since that happened, since that occurred, and I'm actually able to laugh at it now. And I've made jokes about it with my friends, and I'll make jokes about it. My friends are like, are you sure you can joke about this? And it's like, yes, this is my information. But I sat through it and rode through that discomfort, and I was able to get to the other side. But I didn't know where it was going to show up, and it showed up. So while I say all of that, I want to say, on the other hand, this is kind of a meandering podcast intro, and I apologize, and y'all can skip through this if you want to. But after thinking about this more, reading about this more, and talking to other people about trigger warnings, kind of my position has kind of become more nuanced and I suppose compassionate. So I understand that trigger warnings do have a greater purpose of acknowledging someone's humanity and their potential pain. So recognizing that some people just may be experiencing hardships where I don't, at least not right now, can be incredibly validating to somebody. So offering trigger warnings with subjects that I can readily identify as potentially upsetting may be a really compassionate perspective to take. Because I'm conflicted, everybody. I'm conflicted. I would love to help people not feel pain, just as a person, as Kevin, not the therapist Kevin, not as the podcast host. I would love to help people not feel pain or discomfort if I could. And yet, I want to help people feel emotional pain and discomfort so that they can overcome it. It's kind of my weird job. I hate needlessly making people feel pain, but I also professionally make people feel bad. But also, I know that sometimes we feel bad, and that feeling bad is part of life, and that we're not entitled to a pain-free life. So I legitimately struggle with this. And additionally, we need to remember that pain, this is a quippy saying that it sounds like an Instagram post. The old phrase that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. I mean, you and I can work on our perspectives on and towards our pain and our willingness to face it and our willingness to engage in treatment for our various sources of pain. But we have to anticipate that we will feel emotional discomfort, pain, pressure, and stress in life. So I don't necessarily know if I've come to a solid conclusion other than, ladies and gentlemen, in the future, I may offer trigger warnings for some content that I may be able to identify as bothersome to people. I sometimes put an adult content notice on some episodes. You might see that for some episodes. But I'll tell you, I also may not offer trigger warnings. I offer the content information for what the podcast is about in the episode description. But outside of that, I may not. I may warn some listeners about this content ahead. And, well, then again, who knows? Because simply put, I just don't know what's going to be triggering to somebody and what won't. But I will say this. I would love to know if there is a trigger in the content, if there was something in these episodes that were bothersome to you, that I didn't warn you about, that you didn't know about, that it just crept up, and gotcha. I'd love to hear about what that content was and what you did about it. So how did you manage your reaction? What response did you come up with? What worked? What didn't work? That's what I think would actually be more interesting. What would be more important? So if you have follow-ups to this, and I'm going to put this before the interviews, if you have follow-ups to this or have any questions, comments, hate mail, go over to fearcastpodcast.com. Send it to me in the submit a question link. I will read it. I will see it. But I would love to hear what your thoughts are on this. And again, if there was content that was overwhelming to you, what did you do in response to it? So that's what we're trying to do, right? We can't avoid all pain. We know that we're going to experience pain and discomfort. So how are we going to see it through? How are we going to go live our life and know that sometimes we're going to feel triggered? So without further ado, everybody, here's some of the interviews with my guests, Nathan Peterson, Kelley Franke, and Lauren Rosen. All right. Well, Nathan, thanks so much for joining us for the podcast to talk about trigger warnings.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk to you.
Yeah, of course. Well, so you obviously have a very popular YouTube channel talking about OCD and anxiety treatment. And, sometimes we're going to talk about really uncomfortable and awkward things. And sometimes that can be triggering to some people. And there's a strong movement right now for trigger warnings, requesting trigger warnings. And I wanted to find out what your experience has been with trigger warnings and what thoughts you might have for or against them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the videos that I do, various different topics, and it's very tough. I was debating, should I put a trigger warning probably on every video, because some people can get triggered by anything. Mm-hmm. And I decided, started doing these about a year ago, a little longer than that, and decided I don't think I'm going to put a trigger warning at all on these videos and see what happens. And because my initial thought was, if I put a trigger warning on here, I'm kind of already saying that there's something dangerous about this show. Something dangerous about my video that is going to trigger you, whether it is or isn't. And so I decided not to. And so far, so good. I've only received one comment from somebody ever that was like, what, I think you should probably put a trigger warning in this because it really caused a panic attack in me when I watched your video. And so for me, I remember seeing that person's feedback and thinking, oh, dang, I messed up. I need to put some trigger warnings on here. And after really thinking through it, I was thinking, wait, no, my job is not to protect you from these triggers. My job is to help you understand what to do when you are triggered, which is the whole concept of my videos in the first place, is here's what to do essentially when you were triggered by this specific OCD topic or anxiety. And so that's the hard part is, I think a lot of people maybe don't know how to respond. But at least my view on those trigger warnings is we literally can be triggered by anything. Somebody could be talking about, a cute little bunny in their backyard, and somebody could hear it and say, well, I had a bunny that, something came in the backyard and took it. And every time I hear anything about a bunny, I get triggered and I feel anxiety and I feel distress and anger. And, such a simple little story, but anyone can be triggered by anything. And so I try, at least for me, is there isn't really one topic that is worse than another. It's kind of the mindset we put on it. And for me, I don't want to put that mindset, at least on my videos, of like, this one's more dangerous than this one. And at least that's kind of my viewpoint on some of those trigger warnings. I could see how they could possibly be helpful in some ways or another, but it's really how the person can respond to it. The ways that it's going to be helpful, I actually was thinking about this before talking to you, like how would a trigger warning be helpful? And what it comes down to is like, maybe the person would see it to use it as an exposure. I want to be triggered possibly by this, and so I'm going to listen to it. But not everybody's in that boat. Not everybody wants to do that.
Right. Not everybody's ready in their recovery journey to intentionally set out to feel uncomfortable. They might be of that. They might just be at the very beginning, or even before the beginning of treatment, and everything seems threatening around them.
Absolutely.
In what contexts have you, I guess, have there been, or I guess, are there some contexts where you would advise trigger warnings, either in videos or other types of content? I guess where might they be beneficial?
Yeah, at least for me, because I have some pretty, like harm OCD specifically, talking about some pretty interesting things in there that can definitely, I could see could trigger people. Maybe a trigger warning is, I'm going to be talking about harm OCD, or no, maybe I'm going to be talking about something completely simple, but then I talk 15 minutes on harm OCD and you're totally not expecting that. I don't even know if a trigger warning is warranted there, but it might be more of, here's all the topics we're talking about in this thing. I'm not going to put value on if they're dangerous or if they're not. So more maybe a description more than a trigger warning. Talking about harm OCD, we're talking about all these other topics as well. Your choice if you want to listen to it. That way, me as the producer is not automatically telling you what is dangerous and what's not.
Yeah, kind of maybe some. It sounds like you're talking about some self-accountability for looking into the content that you're about to engage with.
Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting concept. Then, like, if you were to put out a video, and if you were to talk about something, or not dangerous, something violent or graphic in nature, that perhaps you might address that in some of like the description of the episode, and leave it up to the person as to whether or not they're willing to jump into it. So, yeah. But I think you're right, and you and I are in the same boat of trying to help people to deal with triggers when they arise, because. I love that bunny example, right? It's that you never know what is going to be triggering to somebody, and you could be talking about something very innocuous to you and me, but all of a sudden that person is, a person that you couldn't anticipate is freaked out by this because of that one thing that happened that one time to them, and it was traumatizing, it was uncomfortable, it was whatever. What advice or guidance would you give that person who all of a sudden is triggered by something that they weren't warned about, they couldn't even anticipate?
Yeah, for me, I look at, well, what meaning did you put upon the thing that you were just triggered about? And that's where I look at is, it wasn't necessarily the thing that you heard that is the problem, the thing that that's the problem, is the way you responded, or even the automatic sense that the body responded to it. That we say, let's actually sit back and maybe not put any judgment to it. We're just hearing what we hear. So if we say, I heard something that, it talked about a knife, for example, and like, oh man, I don't like knives. I can't believe you just talked about that. That I just put a lot of judgment upon that by saying, I don't like knives. They're, possibly dangerous. But what I would definitely advise people to do is, everyone's kind of in their own boat, but it's, how can I not put value on this right now? That I heard the word knife. If I immediately turn it off, then I just said, ooh, this is dangerous, and I don't know if I can handle it again in the future. For me, I'd say, well, maybe we just keep listening. And as we're listening to it, we're not saying knives are good, knives are bad. We're saying, like, it's a word, and words are words. We learn to say how, and it probably sounds like a broken record of like, how can I respond differently? But that's really what it's all about. Like, even if it's can I put my shoulders back? Mm-hmm. Can I smile? How do I look when I'm listening to this thing? Because if I look scared, I'm sending those signals that say that I'm scared. Mm-hmm. That we essentially kind of want to act like we don't care sometimes, which feels like a lot of acting. But the brain needs to know sometimes that it might be throwing out a false signal that really it doesn't know any different unless we train it to be different.
Right. So so in the face of a trigger, you're advising we treat it as if it's not scary. Even though we may be uncomfortable with it emotionally, we can choose which responses we're going to have and show ourselves that this thing doesn't need to be cowered from. It doesn't need to be something that we need to freak out about. It can be treated like it was any other innocuous topic, but we choose how we're going to respond and how we're going to, in a sense, define that thing. Are we going to define it as good or bad or safe or dangerous?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, one thought that came to my mind is that it's not through using logic necessarily. It's not through saying, okay, wait, knives, I need to just tell myself knives aren't bad, so they're not going to be bad. It's not trying to convince yourself necessarily. It's more just saying, all right, well, I heard the word, so how can my body's responding to it. I need to just really act like I don't care, essentially. So if I turn this off, I just said I care. If I'm turning down the volume, I just said I care. Mm-hmm. I need to teach my body that I don't care. And it's not through necessarily convincing myself. It's through acting like I don't care. And if it says, man, this is going to be horrible, I might feel anxiety all day long and I might have a panic attack. For me, I always say those magic words are maybe, maybe not. Mm-hmm. To keep it with that uncertainty that we really don't know what's going to happen in the future, and it's okay to not know. And that teaches the brain that I'm all right with that uncertainty. I'm not going to respond to any threat necessarily that comes to my mind.
Yeah. And I love what you're describing here as well, because it really emphasizes resiliency and that we are able to, in a sense, take the punches of life, as it were, because there will be times that are just stressful or times that are going to get at us, maybe for a trauma, maybe just for something that we've experienced, but that it would not break us, but that we can take that and allow for us to feel whatever we're feeling, and then keep and show ourselves that we have space for that. We have capacity to deal with that and to move through it to whatever the next thing is. Absolutely.
Yeah, I really do feel like we can move through anything. There isn't something that we really can't get past. But the only way that our brain can do that is when we train it to do that.
Right. So practice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your input on this. And if you want to check out more of Nathan's videos, check him out on the YouTubes.
Yeah, YouTube. OCD and anxiety is the name. Pretty unique.
All right. Well, I'll be sure to put a link up to your channel. But again, thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right, Kelley and Lauren, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about trigger warnings. So as you and I have talked about, or as we have talked about a little bit just before this, and nothing else before this, surely, that we wanted to just talk a little bit about trigger warnings, your feelings about them, your experiences with them, and kind of thoughts about how they can, should, or how they do, can, or should relate to the anxiety and OCD community. So I will leave it up to you. It looks like Ms. Franke, Kelley has her hand up. Go.
So I'm going to ask you a question, actually. Are you sure you really want us to talk about trigger warnings?
I have a thought on that. I don't think he would have asked us on his podcast to talk about trigger warnings if he didn't.
I know. The humor didn't translate right. I was basically trying to get the trigger warning from him about us.
That we're going to trigger some people.
Yeah.
That's
thoughtful.
It's thoughtful. It didn't, the joke didn't land. It's fine. Moving on.
I love it. And I know we talked about editing, but I'm going to leave that right in. But yeah, so yes, absolutely would love to have you two talk about trigger warnings. That, yes, to Lauren's point, that's exactly why I had both of you on. So, but yeah, there is a part of this is just a discussion about what your thoughts are on it. There is no necessarily right or wrong way, since the idea of trigger warnings and the use of them seems to be maturing and developing just day to day, week to week. But I'm curious about what your experiences have been with them and your present thoughts on them, as controversial or not as they may be.
Well, on that note, no, I actually think that to talk about trigger warnings and how I feel about them, I have to first talk about triggers and how I feel about them. And I think that my view changed significantly after I went through my own OCD treatment, and certainly has changed as a therapist, that I used to think of triggers as a dirty word, right? They were bad. And I think that that's probably most people's experience of them initially, is like, ooh, I don't want this thing. And unfortunately, that's so counter to recovery. And so the paradigm shift from triggers are a problem to triggers are necessary, and learning to live with triggers requires a lot of triggers to happen. How many times am I going to say the word triggers, by the way? Triggers.
Lots. 1,000.
Yeah. Anyway,
someone keep track.
Somebody ring a bell every time I say it. But I think that the reality is that triggers are opportunities. And as soon as we shift from triggers are the problem to triggers are opportunities, then I think that informs, from my vantage point, the necessity of trigger warnings and the helpfulness or lack thereof of trigger warnings. Because if there's a warning, you're not going to be triggered, right? Or you're not necessarily going to be as triggered, and that's going to make it less of an opportunity, potentially. Not that, actually, I'm going to add one more caveat. Obviously, when we're doing exposures, we're triggering ourselves on purpose. And we know it's coming most of the time, at least to some degree. So it's not like it takes it fully away. But I think that this idea that we need to be warned of something that we're trying to learn how to just make space for and make part of our daily lives and be accepting of, it seems a little bit counterintuitive.
I think that's brilliantly said. Yeah. Yeah. Kelley, any thoughts, or how would you? What are your further thoughts on this, or disagreements?
Yeah, I completely disagree with everything you both have said. Just kidding. Okay,
I'm triggered.
So I'm triggered. Yeah.
Too soon.
Okay, so let me, I guess, talk about my experience a little bit with it, because my experience is actually, OCD was secondary. For me, I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I have trauma. And as Kevin and Lauren both probably know, but probably more Kevin, because I work in an office where I have a blind side, and the way our offices were set up, I have a huge startle response. Like, right, Kevin?
She really, really does. I think I almost killed her 100 times. Also, to be fair, real. I come in and out of doors very quickly and abruptly.
Yes,
and true. That is alarming to some people. And even my wife, who shares an office with me now and is the office next door to me, she has said, you're really loud with doors.
Well, and you move swiftly through them. Like, you mean business. Like, you're like in and out. This is a serious transaction between you and the door.
I don't have time to deal with doors.
Okay, fine.
They just get in the way.
They really do.
Okay. Whew. All right. So point is that I was told multiple times, startle response is one of the hardest things to get rid of. And the harder I try to remove that startle response, it seems like the stronger it gets. But the point is there's always going to be triggers around me that cause a trigger. There's some type of trigger that is going to give me some type of response that I don't like. It's either going to be the startle response. It's either going to be, I want to crawl into a ball and remove myself from all human beings. And neither of those are good, right? But the reality is they happen all the time. I cannot avoid them. I have to live with them. And in fact, it's good, just like in the OCD world, it's good because now I'm learning to have a new relationship with somebody running out of the door really fast. It's not a predator. It's just Kevin. Maybe he's a predator. I don't know.
Dun, dun, dun.
Right. Great white shark. Here he comes.
We will all have to live with the uncertainty about that. Well, so I appreciate both of your experiences. And I mean, it is interesting to hear your perspectives on trigger warnings as they to a certain degree, they come to the same conclusion, but you're also approaching it from a different angle, one from kind of more OCD anxiety perspective, one from more of a PTSD perspective. And I appreciate both of you for sharing that and being vulnerable with the listeners on that. I'm curious though about, so it sounds like your perspective is that we need to be able to find a way to make space in our life for triggers, just kind of knowing in life that we're going to be triggered by stuff. Is there, and therefore then, the trigger warning itself kind of undermines, at least from kind of Lauren's perspective, it's going to undermine the effectiveness of the exposure treatment, so that we're not kind of getting used to the fact that exposures exist. In your opinions, is there any appropriate use of trigger warnings? Is there a time when trigger warnings might be appropriate or helpful or beneficial?
I think actually, and I'd love to have a dialogue with you, Kelley, about this right here, right now. I think the whole idea with treatment for OCD, anxiety disorders, and for PTSD for that matter, is about learning to have this better relationship with our triggers, like you just said, Kevin. That being said, we all know that it's gradual, right? You don't have to do it all in one fell swoop. And so from that vantage point, I'm not the anti-trigger warning over here. I think that if there is something that is intense and that has a high likelihood of eliciting an intense response from a lot of people, that having that warning there and just saying, hey, just FYI, this is what you're about to look at, in some cases can make sense, because it allows for people to self-select and to, as long as the general idea is, okay, I don't need to get rid of triggers or try to escape them, that being able to navigate a trigger in a gradual manner does make sense in some respects. So how's that for totally contradicting my last thought on this?
It's not. I think it's that it's nuanced, right? And
the dialectic.
Yeah. And I think in my own treatment for both, trauma and OCD, is that like I said, and we've all been saying, you cannot avoid them. We can definitely shift the paradigm and say this is an opportunity to grow and to learn that this is actually a pretty safe trigger, right? So that it's no longer a trigger. But I think even as a therapist who treats OCD and anxiety, as we all do, is that we titrate it. We don't just we don't flood people. We create a hierarchy, or we pick and choose certain things, right? Like we're not going to torture our clients. That's not, we want to have them back in our office is my point. Mm-hmm. So the end of the day, you can give an exposure on their way between your office and their house. There's going to be some type of unexpected trigger that's going to send them through the roof. It's not going to kill them though. It's not going to hurt them. Probably they're not going to die.
Hopefully.
Maybe though.
Yeah. Well, we have to accept uncertainty.
We do.
As we all know too well. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's going to be some sort of trigger. And to that end, I think if there's not a trigger warning on something and you get triggered, it's an opportunity to find your strength and to see your capacity rather than an actual issue.
You can handle it. You can handle it. And in, prolonged exposure work, with trauma stuff, it's a lot of it is actually it's mindfulness, right? And being aware of the physical experience of anxiety and actually using the SUD scale and listening to an audio recording. And you're listening to it, you're rating it. And then once you're kind of out of that the window of distress, is it window of tolerance? Window of tolerance. Mm-hmm. Once you're out of your window of tolerance, which, this is an audio recording or I would draw it for you, then you want to just kind of pause and come back and use grounding techniques, right? Is that we're trying to learn how to pace ourselves in a manner that's like, okay, I can handle coming right out of that window of tolerance and being really feeling out of my body. And I can actually learn how to re-regulate myself back in. So, yeah.
Yeah. Excuse me. And you're already getting to what my next question was going to be, which is if, what advice would you give to someone who is either starting their exposure route and trying to figure out where they fit in, or how they're going to better interact with the world around them? How should somebody best deal with triggers? Are there some tools or techniques that you'd recommend just off the bat to deal with triggers broadly? And how does that work if they don't get these trigger warnings? And how can it work if they do get trigger warnings? To just make it more complicated, I suppose.
I think when somebody actually says, hey, this is a trigger warning, do you know what happens? You get triggered. Oh. Believe it or not, I read into this research at some point. Mm-hmm. You actually get triggered because your brain is so creative that the moment someone says trigger warning, it fills in the blank. Boom. Trigger has occurred already.
I'm probably going to cite some of this research at the very top end of the show as well.
Yeah, now I have to find it.
Minor details.
Shoot. This was a while ago, but I'll find it. Just make a note.
Yeah, but that's the thing. So I guess one way or another, you're getting the trigger so that you can work with it. Right? I mean,
yeah.
If you're getting triggered by the trigger warning or triggered by the content. And the problem is that, sorry, I know this is maybe a little bit of a digression, but that triggers are so varied that if we were to cover everybody's triggers, there'd have to be a trigger warning on everything, which I think is just a different way of saying what we've already said, but just.
But I also that's also a good point. Is to a certain degree is the impetus for this episode itself. Is that I will have shared this story already, but I had an episode talking about, let's say, topic A, and then someone messaged me and said, well, they really wanted a trigger warning for topic B, but I wasn't, but it had nothing to do with topic A. I would have no idea because I referenced something related to topic B throughout the episode in relation to topic A, but the episode was not about topic A, and topic B was about 4 seconds of discussion.
Right.
So there's kind of this like balance of like, well, how does one deal with the reality that sometimes, even though I did say at the top of the episode, we're going to be talking about topic A. That was the title of the episode. There almost was this expectation, well, I'm going to be talking about things related to this, but topic B that was not expected. But then again, I had no idea that topic B was going to be a trigger. How can... I guess where would you see the ownness of this? And I suppose to a certain degree there is a reassurance seeking on my end to make sure that I am not the a-hole in this. But it's also I've also to a certain degree let myself off the hook, because how was I supposed to know that topic B was the problem? Or was ever going to be a problem?
So I think what we all learn right now is that Kevin is anxious.
How dare you?
Moral of the story is he moves quickly through doors, anxiously. You're welcome.
I don't like that this podcast all of a sudden started talking about me. Let's talk about you two now.
Yeah, we already talked about me. Okay, the uncertainty, right? It's all about uncertainty. We don't know. There's no guarantee that even by saying this is a trigger warning, that you're not going to even just trigger somebody who's like, oh, no, it's fine. I can handle this. There's just, you can't, we don't know. No one knows. There's no answer.
Right. In terms of dealing with it, in terms of your question about how would I advocate for somebody to deal with a trigger, so much of it is about making space for the discomfort that comes after that trigger's arisen. And so I love acceptance and commitment therapy's technique of expansion and finding where your feelings live in your body. How do you know you're uncomfortable? Well, I've got this sort of like tightness in my chest area, and I've got a lifting feeling in my stomach, what have you. And then breathing in and making space for those feelings. Not, I'm going to breathe in the good and breathe out the bad. Like I think so many of us were heard as children. We're like, here, good cleansing breaths or whatever. That it's more about like, how do I be a gracious host to this feeling?
Right. And yeah. Oh, sorry, Kelley, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think this is what I was talking about in terms of the trauma exposure work, is that we are intentionally triggering ourselves when doing that work, and to then notice when our body has kind of, when it's literally trying to remove itself, our brain is removing itself from our body because we're so overwhelmed, and to say, okay, it's happening. And then using grounding techniques. What do I hear? What do I smell? What do I taste? What do I feel? Right? Like coming back to those 5 grounding that's how we get into the present moment and still have anxiety. Because when we're doing that, we're actually not getting rid of anxiety. We're just coming back to the present moment. Anxiety is still high. I promise you, because I've done it so many times. I've probably done it 10 times already today, honestly. But it's we have good weeks and bad weeks, and hard weeks, I should say, challenging.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like it's the continual return to how do we make space for the fact that we're going to feel uncomfortable, and that anxiety is just part of living life, and also knowing that for some of us will have more anxiety than others, and if we are one of those people that have the more anxiety, knowing that we are going to be triggered more, but that we can tolerate that. And anxiety is just one of those, stupid feelings that shows up from time to time that eventually will go away and eventually will come back, but not treating it as if it's the end of the world.
No, quite the contrary, treating it as, again, this opportunity. And this is where I kind of, building on expansion, I kind of like the idea that you're going to like huff your anxiety.
Oh yeah.
I'm not, by the way, I'm not advocating for huffing, nor have I ever huffed.
Sure, Lauren.
I know, right?
Kevin and I know different.
Yeah. I made it to AA at 19, but I never huffed. How's that for interesting?
Not yet.
Interesting. Fun fact.
Not yet. But to really like I'm going to get a good nose full of that anxiety, like, dig in, and having that attitude, the sort of exposure mindset of wanting it, like Reed Wilson says.
Yes. I think it's funny because my therapist who walked me through a lot of my recovery with trauma work was, and I'm actually intentionally only talking about trauma because I think Lauren's covering OCD, by the way. It's not because I have anything against talking about OCD, but she goes, Kelley, what's it like for you driving from work to here? Like, I imagine you're trying to get yourself pumped up, right? Like you're going to battle. Yes, that's what it's like, but in a good way, right? It's like, I am going to go get it. I'll roll down my windows. I'm like, I am coming for you. It's just going to battle. And it's a very, very empowering process. There's going to be times though, where it hits you in a way that you weren't expecting, trigger warning or not.
Right.
Yeah.
So being open to the unexpected.
Correct.
All right. Well, I don't want to take up more of your time. I appreciate both of your opinions on this.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us. It was really nice to be on.
Anytime. All right, everybody, thank you so much for making it through that potentially very controversial, potentially very upsetting and annoying episode. So I apologize, don't apologize, but I apologize in a sense. But thank you all for making it through. If you have questions or comments or feedback about this, again, go to fearcastpodcast.com, send me a message over there. I'd be happy to hear it. And man, if this just blows up the world and everybody hates it, I would be more than happy to post a bunch of comments and a bunch of your feedback on a future episode. But if you have questions for a future episode, go over to fearcastpodcast.com, go to the submit a question link, and send it to me over there in text. If you would like to send an audio question that will get bumped up to the top of the list for me, send it to questions at fearcastpodcast.com, or again, send me the link through your Google, your shared Google account, or wherever it is that I can download it from. All right, everybody, please remember that the Fearcast is not a substitute for psychotherapy. If you have questions about treatment and want to get started with your own therapy, go to fearcastpodcast.com. Go to the Find Help link, and there'll be some stuff that might be a little bit helpful for you over there. So until next time, everybody, take a risk, challenge yourself, and don't take your brain too seriously. Bye.